Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Greetings. Thanks, friends, for joining us. We're grateful to be able to study God's Word in the Word today and to think about our own teaching and perhaps your teaching as you gather with others to study this wonderful passage from the great prophet Isaiah. We're celebrating Palm Sunday today, aren't we?
Today is the day.
Yeah, so we're recognizing Palm Sunday and thinking about that a little bit. Our viewers may not be watching us on Palm Sunday,
right.
but which is fine. But I just thought I'd mention that we are conscious of that. And as we look through this beautiful passage from Isaiah, we might see some connections to Palm Sunday.
We definitely will
as we
get into it.
That we'll talk about a little later.
Yeah.
Now, in this wonderful series on justice in the prophets, we come to one lesson from Isaiah. Righteousness and justice are a prominent theme in Isaiah, but we just get the one peek at it here. And our lesson title, A Just Servant, is a reflection of the fact that this is one of the servant songs in Isaiah.
Yeah.
Let's make sure...
There are four specific passages that are identified that speak to the servant and talk about the servant. And even though the term servant is used a lot in the latter part of Isaiah to refer to Israel, and occasionally others, for instance, Cyrus is referred to
King
as
of the
servant.
Persians.
Even the anointed, the Messiah, the term is used. But specifically, chapter 42, chapter 49, chapter 50, and then 52 and 53, a longer passage that overlaps the chapter, speak of servant in a way that doesn't exactly fit Israel, because it seems to be a person, and certainly doesn't fit Cyrus in most of the cases, so that there's something unique about them that it's hard to peg. How did this fit into what Isaiah was talking about?
Yeah. The servant here is not just an everyday run-of-the-mill servant working in a field or a household or whatever. This is a servant of Yahweh who is coming to accomplish a very specific and crucial part of his will for Israel and for the covenant people.
And the one we're looking at today mentions how he comes to bring justice, which is really our theme as we're talking.
Right.
But some of the other servant songs talk about his obedience to God and his fulfilling God's mission, and specifically 52:3 talks about the suffering.
Right. That's going to, as these servant songs develop throughout the book, that becomes more and more of a crucial theme. A third word I want to emphasize is humility or gentleness.
Yes.
This servant is not a Cyrus-like emperor, a leader of the Persian army.
He's not a powerful king.
So even though Cyrus is called servant in Isaiah, the servant songs cannot be celebrating anybody like Cyrus. It's a bit of a mystery, really, who Isaiah or what Isaiah is thinking about when he records these servant songs. Some people still insist that we should think of the servant corporately as the nation or as the remnant, the righteous remnant of the nation coming back after Babylonian captivity.
But there are places where it speaks of an individual.
It really sounds so much like a real person.
And as Christians, we look at this and think it's talking of the Messiah.
Right, and to be fair, even many Jews think it is referring to an individual Messiah who is coming. It's just the Christians agree with that, but we think we can identify the Messiah.
The first part of Isaiah's book does use that term, Messiah. The Messiah is coming. And then this latter part of the book talks about the servant, and it seems to put the two together.
Yeah. And in the first part of Isaiah, that's the first 39 chapters, you're right, the language is Messiah, and the emphasis does seem to be more on a political, military role, a leader, Whereas then we get to the second part, starting in chapter 40, where our text is today, and we see a different side of the Messiah. Because we see a different side of Isaiah in a way.
Those two portions are, it's one book, and yet there are two parts that are very different.
Yeah.
The first part, Assyria is the major world power, and there's the possibility of Israel, of the southern kingdom, where Isaiah was, being crushed as the northern kingdom was. The latter part talks about Babylon.
Yeah. So at the very least, the first part of the book seems to be reflecting political and military circumstances of Isaiah's own day.
8th century.
Yeah, the late 700s. And the latter half of the book seems to be reflecting events 100 years or so in the future, where Isaiah anticipates yet another world power arising to trouble Judah.
People coming back to restore and renew.
That's right. There's a big emphasis on restoration toward the end of Isaiah. So Isaiah was a prominent prophet headquartered in Jerusalem. As we mentioned in one of our recent lessons, he seems to have had entree into the halls of power.
Yeah.
He was a priest. He hung out with and advised kings like Ahaz and Hezekiah.
Yeah.
And so he really was a mover and shaker in the capital, and lived during the same time as Micah during the latter part of the 8th century, where we see Assyria conquering the northern kingdom, invading the southern kingdom, and Judah is barely hanging on there during Isaiah's own time. Well, I think that's good background on the concept of the servant songs. Oh, I will say one more thing about the songs. Some people say there are 5 servant songs,
Yes, yeah.
and they point to Isaiah chapter 61, which we will make reference to in our lesson today.
Yeah. It doesn't use the term servant.
No, it doesn't, but the concepts are very similar.
Yes,
So
yeah.
sometimes we'll see a reference to 4 servant songs, sometimes to 5. All right, well, this is the first one, so let me read Isaiah 42, starting at verse 1. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. This is what God, the Lord, says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord. That is my name. I will not yield my glory to another or my praise to idols. See, the former things have taken place, and new things I declare. Before they spring into being, I announce them to you.
That's great.
Well, we see some interesting insights into the identity of the servant here, the servant of Yahweh, but we also see some interesting insights into the nature of God,
Yes.
Yahweh himself. So we'll look for both of those things as we go. Well, he starts off by capturing the attention of his readers. Behold, look here, my servant. It's quite a statement. It's the word behold. Behold my servant. And then we see that there's a close relationship between God and the servant of God with these 3 verbs here in verse 1. First, there's that word uphold that you had noticed.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's only used here in chapter 42 and in 41 in the book of Isaiah. But it's a strong idea of upholding.
Yes, God sustaining the servant so that he can accomplish God's will. And then this chosen one idea is an idea that we see all the way through from the covenant people choosing Israel, all the way up into the New Testament, where Peter describes the church as the chosen people of God. But here we have the servant who's the chosen one. And that idea, in whom I delight, it's that the idea of pleasing God, like at the baptism of Jesus.
Oh, that's what it sounds like.
In whom I am well pleased.
Yes.
Yeah. So God is well pleased with his servant and what he's doing. Now, talk about an interesting connection to Jesus. I will put my spirit on him. Resonates with
baptism,
with the
exactly
baptism.
The vision of the dove descending.
Yeah, that is exactly what we've got going on there. And Jesus also uses this language when he's talking about himself. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he claims, in that great sermon in Nazareth at the synagogue.
Luke chapter 4.
Right. We'll see even more connections to that in a minute. So, but already it appears that Jesus claimed the language used of the servant for himself, which is one of the reasons why I think Christians
see a lot of connections.
Jesus actually drew the connections himself. Now, speaking of our theme in this series of lessons, verse 1 also mentions justice.
You bring justice to the nations.
Yeah, it's not just for Israel, is it?
Gentiles, the Goyim.
This is the Gentiles, the nations. So the servant hasn't come just to rescue Israel from the nations, but to bring God's sense of justice to the nations.
Right.
And I don't think that's just judgment on the nations. I think it's to inculcate in the nations a sense of divine justice.
I think so too.
Yeah. Now with verse 2, we see a little bit, I think, of that humility and gentleness that characterizes the servant in these servant songs, don't you think?
Meek and lowly of heart.
Yeah.
And it brings the old song, he never said a mumbling word.
Yeah, it doesn't raise his voice. It reminds us of so many things in the life of Jesus. When he's on trial, he won't speak up or barely speaks up.
Wouldn't answer.
Definitely doesn't defend himself.
Right.
So the silence of Jesus there at the trial is kind of reminiscent of this. Verse 3 is a little odd, the language here. I think we get the smoldering wick pretty well. Here's a wick of an oil lamp, which were very common, that's barely flickering and hanging on. And if you walk past it, the wind could just snuff it.
Yeah.
But he moves so humbly, so gently, that it doesn't even do that.
And a bruised reed, something that's already broken. We have a little tree by our back walkway down to the lower yard, and there was a limb that we kind of held on to, but it was cracked and then about to break and finally fell off.
Okay.
And I think of that. It's something it's fragile.
Yeah.
But
And a reed is something that does not have a woody stem. So if it got compromised or creased or whatever, it's very hard to keep it stable.
But it's a gentleness that's spoken of here.
Right, yeah. That word wick, by the way, is the word flax, which is, that's the plant product that they used to make wicks, evidently. So I didn't realize that. Well, we learn more characteristics of the servant in the last line of verse 3, and as we move into verse 4, we learn that he bears truthfulness or faithfulness, two ways to translate that word, faithfulness. And once again, we're told he brings forth justice in restoring our relationship with God and with reflecting our right relationship with God in our relationship with others. Now, just because he's gentle and humble doesn't mean he's weak.
Right. He'll not falter or be discouraged.
Yeah.
He won't be crushed.
Right. And that word falter means weak, literally. He is not weak. He will not be weak, and he will not crack or be crushed. And then for the now third time in 3 verses, we're told that he establishes justice on the earth.
I think of the term used in the New Testament, teaching of Jesus about meekness.
Yeah.
I've always thought it's so instructive to think that meekness is not weakness.
Right.
It's really power that's channeled. And someone said it's like a stallion horse that is learned to respond to the bridle. And there's a power that's there.
Yeah.
But it's not out of control, and it's not weak.
Right. And so that concept of gentleness in the New Testament really does reflect this strength under control as you're describing it.
That establishing justice on the earth is his role.
Yeah, and so that's the third time. Justice to the nations was in verse 1. I guess this is the second time, isn't it? Yeah. No, the second time comes at the end of 3. Bring forth justice, and this is the third time.
Establish
in
justice.
verse 4. Establish justice on the earth. Now, the last line of verse 4 says that in his teaching, and that's that word Torah, law, instruction, in his instruction, the islands will put forth their hope. Israel doesn't really have
I was
islands.
going to say there are islands in Israel, but it's almost the concept that Israel's the center of the world, and everything else is peripheral.
Yeah. It can also be translated coastlands, which may be a better way to think about it. But this is probably another way to talk about non-Israelite territory.
Right. It's
in other
the
words,
Gentiles, the nations.
Yeah. It doesn't say Gentiles, but we had the word Gentiles, goyim, in verse 1, and now we have the coastlands, which is probably an allusion to Gentiles in verse 4. We're going to see that word Gentiles yet again in our
6,
passage. Now, when we get to verse 5, there's a major shift here from Isaiah talking about the characteristics of the servant of God to talking about God himself. And we get some lovely emphases here. Not surprisingly, that this Israelite prophet would mention God as creator first and foremost.
And that second part of the book of Isaiah really emphasizes the creation and God as creator.
And that, I think, is directly connected to another of his themes in the second half of the book, which is this restoration theme that you mentioned. If God can create, God can recreate.
Right. Yeah.
If he can create out of nothing and chaos, then he can recreate out of the chaos of destruction and exile. And so I think those two things go hand in hand. The language here is beautiful. This idea of stretching out the heavens like a tent is a metaphor that's used widely in the Old Testament. And then I'm just fascinated by the second part of verse 5, spreads out the earth. It's the word for pounding metal, like a blacksmith would, or a copper worker, or a bronze worker, or whatever. So it's as if the earth is a piece of metal, and God is the blacksmith who is expanding it, making it bigger, and shaping it as he goes.
I think of James Weldon Johnson's famous poem, The Creation. God's taking the mud and shaping it and so
shaping
forth.
it. So here it's kind of with the language of a blacksmith. So he not only shapes, but he animates all that exists by giving breath to its people.
That sounds like Genesis, the breath of life.
The breath of life, I know. So Isaiah is really drawing on Genesis here and the creation account for a lot of this beautiful language. Now, the word people here would indicate Israel. Whereas, so that's the word A-M, which refers to the people. That would be Israel. And then that other word, goyim, refers to human beings who are not part of Israel. Yeah.
But he gives life to those who walk on it. And the word life there is the word ruach.
Yeah, spirit. Spirit again. So this is although it's kind of hidden by the NIV translation, this is the second reference to spirit. The first was back in chapter 1, where God put his own spirit on the servant. Mm-hmm. Now we see that God has in fact shared his spirit with all life, all living.
And that's a parallelism again. He gives breath to his people and life and spirit to those who walk in it, the breath and spirit.
Right.
Again,
yeah. Now, when we get to verse 6, we come to a companion concept with justice, in the word righteousness there in verse 6.
And it's important to note that the you and your here are singular. It's back to the servant here.
Yeah, very important. You're right. It's so hard in English because we use the word you interchangeably for singular or plural. Yeah. And he has just mentioned the people whom we identified as Israel. So he could have meant, I, the Lord, have called you Israel in righteousness, etc. But you're right. It's singular in verses, all the way through verse 6. I think the word you appears 4 times, and each one is singular. So he's back to talking about what he wants to accomplish through the servant. Yeah. And one of the things he says is, I have called you in righteousness. Amos is the one whose famous verse in 5:24 says, let justice roll down like waters, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Yeah. And so what we have here are synonyms, which mean something slightly different, but still kind of echo each other. And this is that other word that Amos used as well. Yeah. There's such a personal relationship between God and the servant here in verse 6, isn't there?
Oh,
I will take hold of your hand.
Yes. Yeah.
I will keep you. I will, the language is very tender.
Yeah. And then it's on that same line, I'll make you to be a covenant for the people, make you to be a covenant. So the servant becomes the covenant.
Yeah. It's not just that the servant establishes the covenant or reestablishes the covenant or makes covenant, but is the covenant.
Yeah. And that, again, we look at that and we see Jesus and we see him talking about the new covenant, and he is our covenant.
I can't help but think of that. It's impossible, at least for me as a Christian, to read these servant songs and not think of Jesus at every turn.
Exactly.
So here I think of Paul's discussion about the Lord's Supper and the Gospels as well. This is the new covenant in my blood. So it's Jesus' own person, his own life's blood and his sacrificial death that is the covenant.
Right.
It doesn't just establish it, it is the covenant. And it's for all people.
Yes.
Not only for the the people, but for the Gentiles as well.
A light for the Gentiles.
Yeah. And
that brings us to Isaiah chapter 60.
Isaiah chapter 60 picks up on this theme of light and says, arise, shine, for your light has come. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. The Lord will arise upon you. His glory will appear. Nations will come to your light.
Yes.
So this is a theme now that Isaiah is going to carry right on through to the end. Now, speaking of themes in Isaiah and beyond, verse 7 is just crucial for our understanding here.
Yes.
To open the eyes of the blind, free captives from prison, release those who sit in darkness.
That's Isaiah 61.
Yeah.
And that's what Jesus read in the synagogue at Nazareth, recorded in Luke chapter 4, and said, today this scripture has been fulfilled.
Right. So it's as if Jesus is taking Isaiah 42, the servant song, where he says, I will put my spirit on him, and verse 7, where it gives the agenda of the servant and applying it directly to himself in the hearing of his hometown folks there in Nazareth.
Yeah.
It didn't sit well with them, did it?
No, matter of fact, they were ready to throw him over a cliff.
I know. So him claiming to be the servant, as it were,
and
is challenging to them.
And his inclusion of God caring about other people than them.
That's right.
That's what set them off.
That's right.
And it again is reflective of this light to the Gentiles.
Light to the Gentiles, because in that sermon, the two illustrations he gives from the Old Testament are Elijah and Elisha ministering to the needs not of Israelites, but of foreigners, of Gentiles.
Yeah.
And that is just exactly what the servant song says the servant is all about.
Yeah.
For the Israelites and for the Gentiles. So what we see here is Jesus' agenda. We see it, and I think he claimed it in Luke chapter 4, verse 18. Our viewers might want to go and look at that passage to see how Jesus used the very language of Isaiah 42 here. I would might mention also that although the preaching in Nazareth was not the first thing Jesus did in his ministry, Luke takes that event and tells about it even before he tells about earlier events in Capernaum.
Yeah.
In other words, he moves it chronologically up to the front of Jesus' ministry, and I think he does that on purpose to say, this was Jesus' agenda.
Setting the agenda for what he was going to be doing.
And here we see it's the servant's agenda.
Yeah.
Well, we come back to God in verse 8. I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give over my glory to any other or my praise to idols.
And the book of Isaiah is strong on saying how ridiculous it is to make an idol and act like that you can worship that.
Yeah.
And so this fits in with what he's saying all through the book.
And as kind of a foreshadowing of the images of restoration that you mentioned earlier, verse 9 says, the former things are in the past, but new things are on their way, and I declare them. So we see a new day coming, a new age coming, and whether we should apply that to the restoration of Judah after the Babylonian captivity, or if the new thing is going to be the coming of the Messiah, or maybe both.
Yeah. And Jesus talked about new wineskins.
That's true.
You can't put old things in
That's
new
true.
wineskins.
So new things are coming. Well, as we mentioned, we are conscious of it being Palm Sunday when we think about the Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And it's interesting that although Jesus stated his agenda in terms of the servant's agenda at the beginning of his ministry and got some negative pushback, a similar thing is really happening in his entry in Jerusalem, isn't it?
It's often called the triumphal entry, which is a Roman concept of a general coming back after a victory with all the slaves.
Yeah.
But it really is reflective of Zechariah's prediction of the royal entry, the king coming on a donkey.
Yeah.
And that's Jesus, the king.
And coming in humility, not in conquest.
Right.
Yeah. So there's an interesting connection to Palm Sunday today. Say, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a fascinating study from this first great servant song. I hope you'll have an opportunity to join us looking at other of these servant songs. They're really quite instructive. And I hope that we can all kind of live leaning into this week, looking for ways to emulate Jesus' agenda and his will in our lives. We'll see you soon.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.